So, so John, just I think for the sake of everyone watching, maybe you wanna start off just with a bit of your history and how you got to get involved into jiu-jitsu.
Oh,
So what happened that suddenly you jumped in the mat and start training? Share with us
that's
a
true.
bit.
There's something interesting about most people's participation in jiu-jitsu is very different from your own experience. Hodge, you grew up in a jiu-jitsu family, so for you it was the family business. But for most people in jiu-jitsu, they need some kind of reason. You know, how did it happen? In my case, it was particularly strange because there was no Brazilian jiu-jitsu in the United States when I arrived, at least on the East Coast of the United States. Various members of your family had come to America, I believe, in the late 1980s, but they had mostly been based on the West Coast. So when I arrived in New York City in 1991, I came here as a graduate student at Columbia University. I was on a financial scholarship, but New York City is an expensive place, and I was always looking for extra money to fund my extravagant lifestyle. And I worked as a security guard, as a bouncer. And growing up in New Zealand, I had done what were by far the most popular martial arts at that time in most countries, which were striking-based martial arts, mostly kickboxing. And there's a sense in which growing up in the 1980s, most people more or less dismissed grappling as an effective martial art. The idea that the best fighter in the world was understood to be the best striker in the world. So in the 1980s, it was near unanimous opinion that the greatest fighter in the world would be, say, Mike Tyson. The idea that grappling could be an effective part of fighting and street fighting was not really even taken seriously. The only time I even saw grappling in New Zealand is whenever they would have an Olympic Games on, you would see wrestling. And we would look at it like, well, that's a really weird looking sport. And we didn't associate it with fighting at all. There was in New Zealand, but they were very small and didn't really have much notoriety. So when I came to America, my understanding of martial arts was very much, striking was the basis of martial arts. Then when I started working as a bouncer in New York City, I was absolutely stunned at the effectiveness of some wrestlers and judo players that I worked with in bouncing.
You're a bodybuilder, right? You're pretty huge, no?
Sorry?
You're a bodybuilder. You're so big.
Yeah.
Much
That's
bigger.
I used to do a lot of like amateur bodybuilding. So I was physically bigger in those days. So here it was. This went completely contrary to all my perceptions about what would be effective in a fight. These guys could grab someone, hold them down on the ground, tie them up in knots, and it was effortless. Now this stood in contrast to people like myself, who basically the only recourse we had to immobilize someone was to knock them out. And that's not kindly looked upon in a nightclub security guard context. You're not supposed to knock out the clientele. You're supposed to control them. And no one was better at controlling people than these grapplers. So I used to ask them questions, and they would show me things here and there. And it all came to a head when a friend of mine at Columbia University told me he had started doing this martial art called Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. Now, I was shocked. And Brazilian Jiu-jitsu, like Jiu-jitsu is Japanese. Like, what do you mean a Brazilian Jiu-jitsu? It didn't even make any sense to me. But he told me it was a grappling style of martial art where it was mostly fought on the ground. Now, that interested me immediately because my experience in bouncing was whenever a fight gets serious, someone's going down to the floor immediately. It just naturally and organically happens. So that was interesting to me. And he said that it was a grappling style where they replaced the idea of pinning someone on the ground with submission holds, and that you could fight from underneath people. It didn't even matter how you went to the ground. You could be in top position, bottom position, didn't really matter. They had effective ways to submit people with strangleholds and joint locks. Now, that sounded interesting. Now, this guy was much smaller than I was. At that time, I think I was around 220 pounds. He couldn't have been more than 150. And he had only been training for 2 weeks Okay. And he said to me, as he described these techniques, I've only been training 2 weeks, but I feel like I'm getting pretty good. Now, I was skeptical. I was like, 2 weeks, come on, man. How good can you be? You're half my size. So he said, why don't you put me in a headlock and see if you can hold me down? So I was at Columbia University in my office, and the office hours had just finished. So I cleaned out some area. I put him in a headlock down on the floor of the Columbia University philosophy department, and I held him in a headlock. And to my absolute shock, he started squirming around behind me. I was holding as hard as I could. I was twice the size. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, he started almost getting my back. And I didn't know anything about grappling, but I understood someone getting behind you was never a good thing in a fight. So I had to scramble to my feet and get away from him. And I was pretty tired. My arms were tired. And I'm thinking to myself, this guy's been training 2 weeks. He's half my size. And I didn't really control him successfully on the ground at all. And if he could have got behind me, that would have been bad. So I got curious. So I went down to his school. It was affiliated with Renzo Gracie, but Renzo wasn't yet in New York. So it was being run by another guy called Craig Kukak. And soon after that, Renzo would come to New York. My first day experience of jiu-jitsu, you must remember, I was 28 years old when I started. So I wasn't like you. I didn't start at the age of 5. I started at 28. My first day experience of jiu-jitsu was probably the same as everybody else's first day of jiu-jitsu if they started as an adult. And that was me getting my ass kicked by literally everyone in the gym. And I remember swearing to the moon and the stars at the end of that workout, I have to at least become decent at this martial art. I may not be good at it, but I can't be in a situation where people half my size are easily submitting me. And I got my ass thoroughly kicked and was hooked on it ever since.
Nice. And here you are.
I think there's a huge difference between how people got introduced to jiu-jitsu in 1995 North America as to your own experience, Roger. You grew up in a Gracie family, starting from childhood. But for most people, I think in North America and probably your own students in England, it's something they start as an adult and often from another martial arts background. That was certainly the case in the mid-1990s. Now I think it's starting to change in North America and England. Now you're seeing younger and younger people starting to get introduced to the sport. I think it's a very healthy thing, by the way. But the 1990s experience was usually someone in their mid-20s or even mid-30s starting and trying to learn as much as they could and play catch up.
Yeah, because now the parents, they all know what jiu-jitsu is, so they know how it's and benefits, so they want the child. But I think it's a very experience by themselves or seeing other adults.
No, the whole concept of learning jiu-jitsu now is very different from when it was then. It's an interesting thing, Hodger. You must have had a very similar experience when you first started teaching in England that Renzo had when he first started teaching in North America. Renzo came to New York, I believe, 1995, 96, and you came to London in the early 2000s. Now, England was a little bit behind America in the adoption of jiu-jitsu. When Renzo first came to New York City, you have to understand that it was a jiu-jitsu vacuum. There was, when I first joined his jiu-jitsu classes, there were only 2 purple belts in the whole East Coast of the United States. It was, besides Renzo, it was literally years until I saw a black belt. Like black belts were like unicorns. Oh my God. Even just seeing a purple belt was a remarkable thing. And I'm sure it must have been similar for you when you first moved to England. There just weren't that many advanced belts out there. And so there's a sense in which both you and Renzo had a shared experience where you had to take a martial arts community from a dead start, just nothing, and try and build them up from there. And both of you have done a remarkable job. Renzo produced so many good students over the years, and many of your students, Hodger, have come to New York City to train and always been very, very impressed by their skill level. So you guys both had a very difficult job, which was to take the jiu-jitsu scene from nothing and build it over time. And both of you had remarkable success.
Yeah, no, I agreed. I agreed. I think I sort of got the beginning after my father. I think when he first came to England, it was very similar in a way that Hansel was in New York in terms of people, they had no idea of jiu-jitsu. So, a lot of people, they want to come in and test themselves.
Oh
They
yeah,
want to, they walk into the academy to see what this jiu-jitsu is, sort of almost like a test. Let me try out with who's the instructor, who is the fighter here. I think
I'm
my
sure.
father was like that. He had to, almost to fight off the students, not like, fight off in terms of fighting, but, there was some people that they just want to try, like a fresh
Yeah,
beginner. They didn't come for a class. They came in to test, to see what jiu-jitsu is. I think I had a
absolutely.
bit of less than that. I got, jiu-jitsu was very early, what you're saying, there was 2 purple belts in New York. I think, like when I opened the school, there was like 1 purple belt. I had like students, maybe 2 blue belts, all beginners. So very, very on the early stages, uh, there might be other black belt that came from Brazil too, was teaching in the UK, but it took years and years for the people here to get the belts and to develop. But I think in New York I think Europe in general is different than New York, because New York, you have the wrestling, which is very common for everyone. So the people, Americans, they are more familiar with grappling. So it's more acceptable, their nature is like, it's not completely strange to grapple someone, to do like a martial arts that you have to grapple. So
Yeah,
I think it's in a sense, in America, it was easier for the development of jiu-jitsu, faster, I think, than in Europe. I think London, I mean, now it's very popular, but if you look at other countries, there's no wrestling. If you think about martial arts in Europe, it's striking based, karate,
yes, yeah,
kung fu, is kickboxing, boxing. So I think it kind of here is still kind of behind, because older people, adults that they never saw grappling or anything like that, it's harder for them to accept that that's the efficient way of fighting. Like everything that they believed their whole life is not the most efficient way. It's not actually what they believe it were.
yeah, yeah. That was very much the case with my own worldview when I came to New York. The idea that wrestling would be a martial art was not even conceivable. Martial arts were, karate, kung fu, boxing, Muay Thai, any kind of striking-based art.
Yeah.
And the idea that wrestling was a martial art was unheard of. But thankfully, all that perception has completely changed now.
Yeah, and then UFC 1 came in and shocked the world.
Yeah, that did shock the world. I mean,
Yeah, it's like, oh.
yeah, it shocked the hell out of me. That's for sure.
I mean,
I remember watching early UFCs, and it was literally like my whole worldview got turned upside down, and it started a true revolution in modern martial arts.
yeah, I think for hundreds of years, people, maybe in the past, people thought it differently, but in the modern days, martial arts, it's striking. It's not
Yeah,
grappling on fight on the floor. Every concept of self-defense martial arts, you come from standing up with your face up. That's how you
absolutely.
defend yourself. And suddenly somebody's grabbing you and taking you down. It's like, it's whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
and
Um,
and you start training. How long till you thought about teaching?
It was actually, I had literally no intention of teaching jiu-jitsu when I first started. The whole reason I came to America was to do my PhD in philosophy at Columbia University. I saw jiu-jitsu only really as a method of making my job as a security guard in nightclubs easier. That was my whole motivation for joining. I had no ambitions to teach or even to become a black belt. I just wanted to be competent at jiu-jitsu, be a decent blue belt or a decent purple belt at most, so that I could give a good workout to the black belts and easily overpower someone who had no skills in jiu-jitsu. That was my ambition. As I trained in this framework, there were several outstanding students that Henzo had. Ricardo Almeida, Rodrigo Gracie, and Matt Serra. And they were the senior students.
You got the fun part.
they were the senior students and working their way towards Positional. And they were, of course, interested once they all three of them became champions and in ADCC and other forms of competition. They all had ambitions to go into mixed martial arts, and in time they all went to open their own schools in the area around New York. And as such, they drifted away from Renzo's and went on their own career paths. So there was a period where Renzo was fighting in Japan, and his three senior students had to open their own schools. And one day there were no teachers at Renzo's main academy in New York City. I was teaching basic introduction classes to people who were coming in for their first day. And Renzo said, "John, you're going to have to start teaching classes. I'm going to Japan." Now, you got to remember, I'm pretty much an amateur at this point. I'm just a guy that was at Columbia University, and I did this as a side gig. It was something fun to do, and it made my nightclub job a lot easier. By the way, guys, if anyone ever tells you that jiu-jitsu is not a good self-defense art, don't listen, okay? Jiu-jitsu made my job as a nightclub bouncer 1,000% easier and safer, okay? It does work at a street fight, no matter what anyone tries to tell you. Even at blue belt level, it makes a big, big difference. So Renzo comes to me and says, "John, you got to start teaching classes." And I remember being horrified at this time, thinking like, who the hell am I? Like, I'm this nobody blue/purple belt. And I got a crippled leg. I didn't even start till I was 28 years old. And now they're telling me I got to teach classes at one of the biggest jiu-jitsu schools in the United States. And I remember thinking, holy hell, I better get better at this. Like, I don't want to be the guy that let the team down. Like, you had Ricardo Almeida, Matt Serra, Rodrigo Gracie, these guys were killers. And now I'm supposed to fill their shoes. I better take this more seriously. So that's when I got serious about teaching jiu-jitsu. And I felt like I did have one big advantage, and that's that I came from a strong teaching background in universities. And so I was good at breaking down information and presenting it in a way where people could understand it readily. I think that was the one advantage I had. Physically, I was a disaster. I have a crippled leg, and I started very late and very old. But I felt that mentally I had a good ability to break down information and relay it to others. That was the one great advantage I had. So over time, I started teaching, and I became the main teacher at the early academy for a number of years, and people seemed to like the instruction that I gave. In time, Renzo brought over some of the other members of his family. He had Igor Gracie came, Gregor Gracie came, Hollis Gracie came, and we settled into a pattern where they taught the night classes and I taught the morning and afternoon classes. And I've been teaching under that pattern ever since. But that's how it happened. There was no intention on my part early on to become a jiu-jitsu teacher. That happened more or less by accident because of the way things happened at Renzo Gracie Academy.
I thought you'd be a philosopher teacher.
That would have been fun.
Yeah.
But there was a certain point where with regards philosophy, philosophy is always one of the great loves of my life, and it still is to this day. I loved philosophy, but I didn't love academia. I wasn't a big fan of the academic lifestyle, and there were certain directions that I thought the American academic institutions were going. There were certain notions of political correctness and what have you that I didn't really agree with. And so I came to say, well, I can always study philosophy. That's always going to be there in my life. I'm not a big fan of academia. Why don't you make a stab working, teaching jiu-jitsu? I thought there was tremendous potential, and I'd seen with my own eyes the degree to which it had played a very positive force in many people's lives, and the degree of dedication that people had once they began the study of it. And I thought there was tremendous potential. So I made a shift that was solidified by the fact that a young student from Canada, George St. Pierre, was coming to train with me in New York. And there was a whole fascinating interface between Jiu-jitsu as a single discipline sport and George St. Pierre's ambition to compete in mixed martial arts, a multidiscipline sport. And that interface between Jiu-jitsu as a pure grappling art and the striking aspects of mixed martial arts was fascinating to me. I saw tremendous potential in him. I thought he was a remarkable young man, even as he first came in as a blue belt. And I thought this is a chance on my part to become part of a radical experiment, a real change that will make a difference in the history of martial arts, where George St. Pierre could become like this prototype for a new vision of mixed martial arts. And instead of seeing mixed martial arts as a bunch of single disciplines battling it out, karate versus jiu-jitsu or Muay Thai versus boxing, suddenly you have this young man who was learning everything together in an integrated fashion and was looking at the interface.
The first one who did that, right?
He was among the first. Yeah, you could say other people that
first one who did it well, I think.
He was the first one who really took it seriously and professionalized it, and it was a remarkable time. And I just thought there was more interesting stuff going on intellectually there than there was in academia. So I made the switch, and I left the philosophy department graduate program, and then it was full time in coaching.
Yeah, I remember coming to New York. It was great days. I remember early in the days when Igor and Hollis and Gregor, they came in. I think that was the time that was coming in to train more, because the same time that Igor moved to New York, I moved to England. So at the same time, I moved here permanently by the end of 2002. And I mean, it's I was coming to New York, for a few years. I did that. Every major tournament I used to come in and spend like weeks training with you guys. There was sometimes it's almost half of my year I was spending in New York.
Yes. Those are some of my favorite coaching memories, Roger. You coming into New York and getting ready for ADCC competition and other forms of competition. I will always look back on those with a smile. They were remarkable training sessions, because you had the greatest grappler in the world going with some of the greatest mixed martial artists of the world, all in the same room, many visiting jiu-jitsu athletes at the same time. And we'd have class sizes in the middle of the afternoon of up to 100 to 115 people. So at certain points, the class sizes were so big that when sparring came, we had to cut the class in half and have half the guys sit out, and it was just a remarkable time. And that period of the interface of grappling and mixed martial arts is always going to be one of my favorite coaching memories. You were a big part of that, Hodger, and you had a huge effect on my outlook on jiu-jitsu, and your development in that time was remarkable. I'm going to come back to that subject later on in this discussion, but it's interesting to note that my own career as a coach has more or less three aspects to it. The first is, before I was coaching, I just saw jiu-jitsu as a recreation. It was something to help me get better at bouncing and protect myself when I was working as a security guard. Then once I actually started coaching professionally, my career was cut in half. The first half was the mixed martial arts phase, where from around 2000 to around 2011, my primary interest was on the interface between grappling and mixed martial arts. This was largely expressed through the careers of George St. Pierre and Chris Weidman, and helping those two get to their championship status was one of the most significant parts of my coaching career. After 2011, when George retired and Chris Weidman moved away to his own gym in Long Island, that's when I started the specialized grappling phase of my career, which most people are familiar with now. And that was the advent of the squad and the leg lock revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And we moved on to a very specialized grappling aspect. But Roger, you were a huge part of that early phase and the interface between grappling and mixed martial arts. And I must say that it was amazing to me how much you would improve year by year. You would come in for months at a time and then go back to England. And every time you would come back, you were noticeably better than you were the previous year. And that idea of progression over time had a big effect on me as a coach. What are the conditions that make someone make progress over time to get towards their jiu-jitsu performance goals? And you were a big part of that.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Because, I mean, you know, when I started coming to New York, I was very young. I think even before I got my black belt. I think first time I came to actually train, I was a brown belt. And I think, I mean, I got what I am today because, you know, I never stopped progressing, like, you know, everything. So I was very young till the day I retired, you know, I stopped. I felt every year of my fighting career, it was better than the one before.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It wasn't even just in your performances in competition. If you just look at your competition record, you can see the progress. It's unmistakable. But it was also readily observable for me as a coach in the gym. It's like I would see that moves you were already good at, you had gotten better at over the course of a year. And there were also new aspects to your game. And that incredible progression over time is so important. It's so easy in jiu-jitsu just to show up and just train. And you can slog away for 5 years. And at the end of that 5 years, you can look back and say, well, could I really get better? And for a lot of people, the answer is no.
I think for most people,
they got tougher, but they didn't get better.
Yeah. Most people, they come to train, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Training, you know, they're not really focused. I mean, of course, some of them are, you know, especially in the beginning, everything is very new. They want to absorb as much as they want. But I think after a few years training, people, they get into a routine. They just go to the academy and spar.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And spar. The learning process is it's long, you know, so it's hard. It's not easy. It's very, I'm not going to say complicated, but it's, you know, it takes a long time for you to master something jiu-jitsu, and there's always answers coming in to challenge your technique, and you have to constantly improve and get better. And I think it's, you know, people in the end, sometimes they lazy in a way, you know, they just want to come, train, sweat, and leave, which makes them learning process much longer.
Yes.
Than normally, you know.
Yeah. No, one of the biggest effects you had on me was the idea of structured and progressive training programs, where the intention is always there should be set goals by the end of a specified time period, where you should be better at the sports performance in those areas. And as you say, most people don't really have any set goals when they come into the gym. They just want to come in and get a workout. But the moment you start to see jiu-jitsu as just getting a workout, that's when you get stagnation. That's when you get two people who train with each other all the time, just do the same moves, and progress just diminishes rapidly. So it's very, very important to have structure in the training programs over time. And only then can you get the kind of long-term progress that's necessary to maximize your potential. It's a strange thing, Roger, that once I started teaching the specialized grappling program around 2011, where we switched from the interface between grappling and mixed martial arts to just pure grappling competition. This was made possible by the fact that there was specialized submission grappling tournaments starting to arise, which weren't there in the early days of jiu-jitsu. Suddenly you had competitions like EBI and Metamoris, where guys could come in and it was just about, can you submit this guy? Matches were in some cases longer, and this opens up a whole new realm of possibilities. that opened up some interesting questions about the very nature of jiu-jitsu as a martial art. I think you'll probably agree with me that when you look at jiu-jitsu as a martial art, it always had tremendous strength in its primary focus, which is positional game on the ground. If you look at most jiu-jitsu athletes, they're all very, very strong in this. Okay, they all have excellent positional skills in both top and bottom position, a tremendous propensity to retain or pass guard, to work from various kinds of pins, et cetera, et cetera. However, there were always two very obvious and major weaknesses within the sport of jiu-jitsu. The first was the whole idea of leg locking. Jiu-jitsu had tremendous upper body submissions, but was noticeably weaker in lower body submissions. And the second obvious weakness in jiu-jitsu was always the idea of standing position and takedowns. My career as a grappling coach has largely been brought up with the idea that we need to overcome these two fundamental problems in the sport. Something has to be done about this. I believe we've done a very good job with leg locks and lower body submissions. If you look at the state of leg locking a decade ago, it was naive at best in jiu-jitsu. Whereas now, at this point in time in 2020, I would confidently assert that the skill level in leg locking in jiu-jitsu is higher than any other grappling sport. And continually getting better. If you look at modern competition in jiu-jitsu, the level of leg locking is extraordinarily high across the board. It's my own students, but across the board, everyone's gotten better at it. We've done a great job of forcing that evolution in the sport and removing one of jiu-jitsu's greatest weaknesses, and in a sense, making it one of jiu-jitsu's modern strengths. Okay, if you take most modern jiu-jitsu athletes now and let them grapple with another style of grappling, you'll see them do very, very well in the leg locking department across the board. So I've been very happy with this, but I do believe we have to focus now on a new challenge, which is jiu-jitsu must develop its own autonomous approach to standing position and takedowns. This will remove the second great weakness of jiu-jitsu. This has to be one of the major concerns of all jiu-jitsu coaches over the next 10 years. We did it with leg locks. I confidently believe we can do the same thing with standing position.
So do you think it's something that has to be done differently?
Yes, I do.
Yes, I do.
I believe the greatest mistake that has been made in jiu-jitsu training with regards to standing position and takedowns has been that jiu-jitsu coaches and athletes have looked at other grappling styles that do have a strong emphasis in standing position and takedowns, and used a very naive approach of just copying and pasting techniques from those martial arts and hoping they will work in a jiu-jitsu context. You have to understand that the rules and desiderata of jiu-jitsu standing position is radically different from other grappling styles. Let's say, for example, you went to a wrestling school to learn takedowns for jiu-jitsu. The first thing you're going to notice is that if you try to apply wrestling grip fighting in a gi context for competition jiu-jitsu with a gi, all the hand fighting is completely different based on whether it's no gi or gi. So wrestling has excellent lower body takedowns, but completely inappropriate grip fighting for gi jiu-jitsu competition. Then if you go to judo and say, well, they wear a kimono just like we do, so that's going to solve the grip fighting problem. Then you look at the rules and regulations of judo and find that they're radically different from jiu-jitsu. The whole nature of what constitutes a successful throw in judo is completely different from jiu-jitsu. In judo, the intent is to throw your opponent with momentum and force onto his back. The greater the amplitude of the throw, the more reward you're given. In jiu-jitsu, the smallest throw scores the same points as the biggest throw. In judo, once the throw is completed, the match is over. In jiu-jitsu, it's just begun. there's such massive differences between the rule sets and what the athletes are trying to accomplish between jiu-jitsu and judo and wrestling, et cetera, that you can't just use a naive approach of learning a takedown from another martial art and then just trying it in a jiu-jitsu match. Jiu-jitsu needs its own standalone approach to the standing position, which fits well with its own unique rule sets and the unique demands of the sport. We can't just use this copy and paste approach, which we've been using for the last 20 years. I think this is going to be the second great challenge of my career as a coach. I believe the leg lock challenge has been largely overcome. There's still work to be done, of course, but no one would, if people looked at a modern jiu-jitsu competition, they would not say, hey, these guys don't know anything about leg locks. They would be like, oh, these guys are damn good at leg locks. Now we need to do the same thing with standing position and takedowns. We have to evolve an approach to the standing position, which is well suited to the unique demands of the sport of jiu-jitsu, rather than just trying to bring on a few techniques and copy and paste and see what we can do. The most valuable study points are going to be judo for gi competition and wrestling for no gi. But there has to be a concerted program of modification and adaptation so that we can take what is desirable from a judo or wrestling context and then make it desirable in a jiu-jitsu context. There are certain throws in judo which work extremely well in judo, given their rule set, but which are completely inappropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu. The same thing can be said of wrestling. And I think this is going to be a really fascinating and interesting challenge for jiu-jitsu over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I agree and disagree with you in a way, because I think you cannot create it like moves, let's say, on the takedown point of view, on judo, for example. I think, it's all the throws are there. I don't think there's anything to be created. I think it's more to be adapted. I mean, of course you can, but it's more adaptation.
I'm not talking about technique creation. The major throws of judo were invented right alongside the major groundwork of jiu-jitsu. I'm talking about their application in a competitive situation. There's also such things as technique selection. There are certain throws in judo which work well given the rules of judo. Remember that judo's primary emphasis is on throwing someone with momentum onto their back. Once that occurs, there's no more concern. In jiu-jitsu, I have to be very concerned about how much back exposure have I generated when I perform a throw. It's no good performing a successful throw, but now my opponent's right on my back with 2 hooks in. I got 2 points for a takedown, and he got 4 points for the rear mount. Nowadays, he wouldn't even be scored for the takedown under those conditions. So there has to be a program based around technique selection. What are the techniques of judo and wrestling which are appropriate for the sport of jiu-jitsu? There also has to be a whole context that there are certain skills in jiu-jitsu which are simply not allowed in judo or strongly discouraged. The idea of setting to guard. If I see someone who's particularly strong in takedowns and standing skills, you always have the option of setting to guard. In jiu-jitsu, you don't really have those options in wrestling or in judo. So jiu-jitsu needs to have a whole approach to the standing position based around the fact that we can do certain things that other grappling styles simply can't do. It's not just about learning some takedowns. It's also about putting them in an overall context of, okay, we're allowed certain things that they're not allowed. There are some takedowns they do which work well in their sport, don't work well in ours. So you're going to have to, rather than inventing new techniques, it's going to be more about technique selection and making their application appropriate for the rule sets of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think it's more, if you look at judo, is how they, when you're going to throw someone, you fully project yourself into that throw, which it doesn't necessarily, you will maintain a top position after you throw your opponent. You're following up, you allow that, you can roll out of it. even yourself, I love the throws you use. You're so committed to the throw that the momentum carries you on, driving you forward. So
Correct.
it's hard for you to maintain a top position after you throw. And like you say, back exposure, any like hip throw, in judo, they don't care about, the back. There's no back taking, which in jiu-jitsu it's fatal.
Yeah, it's the end of the match in jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
The idea is that the rule sets of wrestling and judo encourage risk-taking behavior because they value the throw above everything. So you can take huge risks in judo that you could never take in jiu-jitsu. The fundamental difference in the standing position between wrestling, judo, and jiu-jitsu is that wrestling and judo favor risk. They're looking for amplitude of throw and takedown. The more amplitude, the higher the score. In jiu-jitsu, the score is always the same, regardless of amplitude. The smallest takedown scores the same as the biggest takedown. Secondly, jiu-jitsu is fundamentally different from those arts insofar as jiu-jitsu is risk averse. Okay, jiu-jitsu doesn't reward risk. Judo and wrestling reward risk. The more risk you take, the more points you score. In jiu-jitsu, if you take a risk and expose your back, you're getting punished for taking the risk. Okay, so the whole context of takedowns and standing technique has to be radically changed. There are certain techniques you just wouldn't be likely to use in jiu-jitsu, which are highly successful in both wrestling and judo, just based on the simple idea that they reward risk and jiu-jitsu punishes risk. In general, jiu-jitsu is looking for takedowns that exhibit control rather than amplitude. And so small, low amplitude takedowns, which enable you to finish in a dominant position, are much more appropriate for the jiu-jitsu athlete than big, high amplitude, risky takedowns. And once jiu-jitsu starts to get a handle on this and start to say, okay, the takedowns that we employ are going to be derived from judo and wrestling, no question about that. But the manner in which they're selected and applied ought to be radically different. Building a standing program appropriate for the rules and strictures of jiu-jitsu, I think is going to be a fascinating coaching challenge.
I think on the stand-up regarding jiu-jitsu, if you look, jiu-jitsu players, they have a bad stand-up game.
Yeah.
Overall, it's like it's terrible. It's not bad, it's terrible. Like jiu-jitsu fighters in general, if you look like student-wise, not athletes, but
yes.
athletes. But I think it's, most of jiu-jitsu school is time they spend on the feet. It's very limited. In any school, it's like you teach a class compared to what the time they spend training on the floor, then the time they spend on your feet it's a lot less. That's why I think it's an area that people, they take much longer to develop, especially student, if you look at the beginners class and the intermediate and the advanced, only in the advanced class that you get to do like full sparring, most of it, the beginners you don't. If you go to a judo academy, you start standing up day one, so you develop a much quicker technique. Your stand up gets much better. I think when you're saying about challenging, first people change to they have to change the way they see, the way they train, they make the school run. They have to spend more time on the feet. That's how you get better. Just like you wanna be good in the guard, you have to practice guard. There's no other way to be good at it.
I'm confident we can do it though. If you look at the current state of standing position in jiu-jitsu, it's as bad as leg locking was in 2010. And yet we find ourselves now in 2020, jiu-jitsu's leg locking is pretty damn good. I believe with the right kind of coaching program, we can do the same thing with standing position. Right now, we have a very undesirable situation, which is that the overwhelming majority of even expert jiu-jitsu players are simply incompetent in the standing position. Now, what you say about training time is entirely correct, because most of the major point scoring in jiu-jitsu is performed on the ground. The biggest scores in the sport are pins on the floor, not takedowns. Takedowns only score relatively small points. Of course, most of the training is going to be predominantly on the ground. That's only natural. But what we can't have is a situation where jiu-jitsu athletes, even at the highest levels, are killers on the ground, but completely incompetent on the feet. If you look at judo, for example, their best athletes are killers in the standing position, but they are competent on the ground. Okay, they're not completely incompetent on the floor. Jiu-jitsu needs to be the opposite of that. Our athletes should be killers on the ground and competent on the feet.
Yeah.
Right now, they're killers on the ground, but they're incompetent on the feet. We can't have that. It shouldn't be the case that black belt champions go into competition where the only option they have is pulling guard. They should at least have the option, if the other guy's another jiu-jitsu athlete, they should have the option of being able to perform a takedown. It shouldn't just be the case that they just don't know anything in the standing position. They just have to run and jump guard as quickly as possible. Now, of course, if they're fighting someone who's a specialist in judo or wrestling, of course, the wise thing is to pull guard under those circumstances, of course. But if they come up against someone who's another jiu-jitsu player, then they should pull guard because they want to pull guard, not because they have no option, because they have no other skills. That's what I'm pushing towards. I don't ever see a situation where jiu-jitsu athletes will be better than judo players in the standing position, because 90% of our training is on the floor. But they should at least be competent. They should be able to come out and make a grip, hold a stance properly, take down someone of their own skill level in the standing position if they want to. We can't have situations where champions come scurrying out and just sit the guard because they literally don't know a single standing move. That, I think, we can overcome in a fairly short period of time with a good training program.
Yeah, I think usually people who has a good guard, they have a bad stand-up.
Yeah, I think there's a definite relationship. Yeah.
You know, if you have a top game, you need to be on top, so you need to throw the other, your opponent down.
Guarantee you will also easily learn a good tominagi or a good sumigaeshi, and they could throw someone from standing position right from the start using the same skills that they use from open guard. People were just alerted to the fact that there are many forms of takedown which work very, very well for a good guard player, and their skills they're already using on the ground, they could easily adapt them to the standing position. Many of the grip fighting sequences that a good guard player uses on the ground can readily be adapted to the standing position if they just learn stance and motion on top of their grip fighting sequences. Within a fairly short period of time, they could be quite effective in the standing position.
I think it's changing in terms of, if you look back, it's changing, but it's still very slow. If you look a few years ago, there was no stand-up in jiu-jitsu players, zero. You had like one tomonagi, you have like one guy who has a good judo, and all the rest is just terrible standing and ground game. I think more people, they realize now, that's how important it is to have a good stand-up. I can say that for myself, it changed. I became so much better in every aspect when my stand-up game got better.
Yeah.
And it's, that's when I develop my guard pass a lot more, because now I get to throw people and stay on top instead of having to pull guard because I'm just not good enough in taking people down,
Yeah, you're a good example of this, Hunter. When you moved to England, your judo got noticeably better, and it had a big impact on your training regimen. You became highly competent in the standing position. Now, of course, if you were going to fight a world-class judo athlete, you would pull guard. That's the right thing to do. But when you fought other jiu-jitsu players, you were often able to throw people with foot sweeps, uchimata, et cetera, et cetera. And as you said, that made you a much more formidable opponent for them to deal with. I think that we can do that across the board, even though it can be a little depressing to look at standing position jiu-jitsu in competition today. Remember that 10 years ago, it looked pretty depressing to look at leg lock performance in jiu-jitsu. But now it's 180
to look sideways, to attack someone's foot. It's like, what are you doing? Back in the day, to attack someone's foot is like, what are you doing?
Yeah. I remember it well. Yeah, you're cheating, my God. But we can do the same thing with standing position. And I think that would be an incredible thing for jiu-jitsu. As I said, historically, jiu-jitsu has always had two major weaknesses, leg locks and standing position. I think we've overcome the leg lock one to a large degree. There's still progress to be made, but it's massively better than. And I think we can do the same thing with jiu-jitsu standing position.
Yeah. I think, it's, yourself is a big part of the change in the jiu-jitsu in terms of how people see leg lock. You made your team so effective into the leg lock game. That's like, suddenly you got people that hasn't been training for that long, tapping very experiencing fighters with the heel hooks and knee bar and leg attack. And guys made an evolution so fast. The one thing, I mean, it's the way I see it, not many people can see this, but I think it's with the leg lock game, it's a game changer on the beginning in terms of, people, they're not as prepared to defend. So that gives you a big advantage, even that, maybe you're less experienced or your jiu-jitsu in other areas is not so efficient. So you get like a fast evolution, which, you saw some cases with a lot of the fighters. But I think it's, if you don't change it in a way that cannot be your main focus, if your main focus is still in your attacking the legs, you almost, it hits a wall a little bit. After a while, it becomes your progress, you slow down a lot, because it's if you're focusing on usually like you attack the legs from the guard, bottom or top. Of course, there's other situations to attack, but mainly if you're inside your people's guard or the other way around. But it's once you start focusing if your focusing is in the legs, you will not be passing or sweeping. It's, if you know what I mean, it switches the focus a little bit, which of course you get good at that, but then you get better at the other side, because you cannot, it's very difficult, I think, to positioning wise, your grips, how you prepare, how you're fighting, if you're focusing in the legs or if you're focusing sweep, trying to pass the guard. Let's say passing the guard, for example, if I'm on top of you and my main concern is how I'm going to catch your legs, knee bars or heel hooks, it doesn't matter. So I stop positioning up, or working towards passing your guard, because one way goes against the other almost, If I want to attack your legs, I'm moving my body towards the end. So I'm not moving towards passing your guard. So positioning, the way you progress is different. You're not going to pass someone's guard much if you're focusing on attacking the legs. And especially that game with gi is much harder, much harder, because it's not sleeping. The guy can grab your sleeve, which control your arms. So the effectiveness of that into gi is very different with no gi. You don't see like heel hooks, even though that is not allowed. But even if you were allowed, you still wouldn't see it much. No gi. That's when you go and looking. I think looking like your students, Gordon Ryan, for example. He did that. He had a huge evolution fast. Of course, he deserved because of his dedication, to training. That's what got him better. But I think on watching his progress, how he evolved over the years, I can see that he was very focused on leg locks, which made him good fast and like be able to overcome people be training much longer than him. But I think he had evolution after that. When I say you hit a wall, I think he never hit a wall, but suddenly he passes that wall when he's focusing suddenly in trying to pass people's guard or to sweep. If you look at his fights in ADCC, he did tap some guys on the heel hooks and attacking the legs, but you saw when, most of his fights, he was focusing in passing or sweeping. I didn't, maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't see the way he was fighting, that his focus was in the legs. And and I think probably it's not just in the fight, that reflect the way he was training. So you are his coach, of course you know that a lot more than I. It's now I think he got to the level that he is now because he passed that only focusing in the legs, if you know what I mean. Now
Yeah.
his guard game is much better. He's passing the guard. You can see the way he's controlling people, pinning them down. His domination of his opponent. You can only dominate someone if you can only fully overcome. Not fully overcome. Maybe I'm expressing myself wrong, but let's say fighting, for you to win against someone, that you have to dominate the person. Fight is, if I dominate you, I win. And then the next step would be the submission, but the submission comes after the control. And with the leg lock game, you don't need to control. You go for the submission straight away. You can go from any position. If you look at other submissions, most of it, I have to be dominating you, and now I'm going to look to submit. Like if I mount on you, that's how I fully control and dominating you. Now my next step is to submit you. I'm not trying to submit you back in the guard, And I think in my opinion, looking at Gordon compared to other fighters, he's past that point of getting stuck in the guard. Now he wants to progress, to dominate someone and then finish.
Yeah, you've raised a whole bunch of really interesting points there, Roger. Historically, you're absolutely correct. When I first started coaching the squad around 2010, 2011, there was an obvious problem. George St. Pierre had just retired. Chris Weidman had moved away, and I had many talented grappling students at that point, but none of them competed. When the squad first started, Eddie Cummings, Gary Tonin, Gordon Ryan, and Nicky Ryan banded together over time, and they were interested in competition. They were the first grappling students I had who were interested in competing, but they all had an obvious problem. They were all relatively inexperienced. Gary Tonin was the only one who had any kind of notoriety at that time. I think he'd been training with me on and off from blue and purple belt days, but not full time. But when Eddie, Gary, and Gordon and Nicky started coming in full time, training twice a day, every day, for the first time, I was able to train a core group of people full time, 7 days a week. But they had this obvious problem that they were all very inexperienced compared with their opponents. They were young, and most of them came in as blue belts and simply didn't really have any kind of hardcore world championship competition experience. So the big question was, well, how are they going to beat anybody? Now, the obvious answer was, well, through leg locks, because there was a sense in which I could train them in a relatively short period of time within a 2 to 3 year framework to become very good in that specialized domain where other athletes simply had no focus. They just didn't focus on that whole issue whatsoever. And so you had this meteoric rise of these brilliant young athletes who gained notoriety as leg lockers. They could beat people who'd been training 3 or 4 times longer than them by taking them into a domain where they actually had more experience and more knowledge than their opponents did, despite the fact that overall their opponents had been training far longer than they did. Now, that created a perception which was quite misleading. The perception it created was that I was generating a group of people whose only focus was on leg locking. That was never the case. Remember, the whole purpose behind the leg lock revolution was to attack or to get away from the idea that jiu-jitsu only attacked 50% of the human body. When I began jiu-jitsu, pretty much the entire lower body game was ignored, and jiu-jitsu focused all of its attacks on the upper body. Now, if I had just said to my students, hey, I just want you to focus on the lower body, I would have been making the same mistake in reverse. We still would have been attacking 50% of the body, just a different 50%. That was never the intention. The intention was always to attack 100% of the human body out of a control framework. So the first thing that had to be done was to change the whole idea of what constituted a leg locking program. when I began jiu-jitsu, leg locks exhibited almost no sense of control. They were a target of opportunity. You saw an opportunity when you're inside someone's guard or working from your own guard. You threw in a leg lock and it either worked or it didn't. What we did was to change the nature of leg locking to one based around control. The key concept here was the idea of double trouble, the idea that if we can control both of our opponent's legs at the same time, you can turn an ashigarami or leg entanglement into a grip almost as controlling as a traditional pin, like the mount or the rear mount. Not quite as controlling, but almost as controlling. And that definitely massively increased the success rate of our athletes in competition. But never was it the case that I wanted to substitute the idea of, okay, everyone else is attacking the upper body, let's just focus on the lower body. I had to do that because they were so inexperienced, and it gave them an immediate advantage in those early days. But always the training program was on attacking 100% of the human body through control. And a big part of that, of course, meant positional control. So that what you see is an organic evolution in the squad, that as time went by and their skill sets improved, especially their positional skill sets, they no longer had to rely exclusively on lower body attacks. In fact, my personal favorite belief, my personal opinion is that the single most dominant position in jiu-jitsu is not legs at all, not even close. The back is by far the most controlling and dominant position in the sport of jiu-jitsu, at least for pure grappling. Nothing.
Do you think mount is not equal to back?
Mount is better, I think, when there's fisticuffs involved in mixed martial arts competition. It's also particularly effective when you have a gi on, because you can strangle very effectively from the front with a gi. But for no gi submission grappling, I favor the back above the mount in a grappling context. So you're not going to get anyone's back unless you can threaten positional play. You can get past someone's legs and either get to the mount and from the mount cause pressure, which turns them to makes them turn their back, or in order to avoid the guard pass, they surrender their back and you jump on board and work from there. So always there was that program, but it took time to manifest because other jiu-jitsu players, their competition, are already very good positionally. So this was not something that could happen in the first days when these kids were blue belts and purple belts. It wasn't until they became mature black belts that they could exhibit more of that positional control. And you see that now with my students. There's a much broader application of submission holds over the whole body. It's no longer the case that they just leg lock people. Now you see a much wider array of submissions, and you'll see more of that as time goes by.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not implying that, you know, your focus was just in the legs, by the way. I never
I just think a lot of people did think that.
I think it's natural when, you know, like your students, they becoming good at footlocks. They just try more, and naturally they become good at it. It's, you know, of course they trying everything, but it's natural when you're good at something that's, you know, your weapon, you want to use it against your opponent more.
Yeah.
But
it's also that people tend to, whenever you play a pressure combat sport, the victories tend to come where your opponent is at their weakest. And in the early days, around 2010, most people were weak on leg lock defense. But of course, this changed over time. Many of our opponents now are very savvy in leg lock defense. And so it's much less likely you'll get the easy breakthroughs that you would used to get, you know, around 2012, 2013. There's still, you know, even in the last ADCC, there were some obvious examples of elite level athletes who simply hadn't practiced leg lock defense at all, and they were quickly eliminated in the competition. But most competitive athletes now are very much aware of the danger and do a much better job defending themselves. So you're seeing the true ideal of jiu-jitsu, which is to attack the whole body with control, leading to submission.
Yeah, I think that's also why things are going towards slightly away from leg lock a little. You know, it's not as focused as it was before. Of course, it's still there. I'm not saying people are not doing anymore, but I say less. You know, you see less submission from leg lock, because suddenly, you know, if you look when your squad became, like, let's say, good at the leg locks attacks, very few people outside your team will actually good at it too, specialize. They were
Yeah.
focusing on leg locks. Now everyone is aware because they are tired of tapping, they don't want to get submitted anymore. So of course they're practicing. So naturally they become good at defending. So it becomes harder for, to catch people. Then it's natural to suddenly start changing towards the goal because it's not as effective in terms of people. They're just more aware of defending, which is, is a natural, of course, naturally. And I mean, you're doing such a great job with in coaching. You should be very proud of your team. I think when I didn't get the beginning of it because that was when I wasn't coming to New York much to train. I think before Weidman, when he started training like regularly with the guys, was just in the end that I was just when I kind of stopped coming. Before my fights, I started going to LA to train at Black House with Lyoto.
Yes.
Yeah, because I think the last 2 times that I came to New York, it's, the team wasn't that focusing in MMA, so I didn't feel I got the training I need. And then I signed with Black House, and I had like Glover and Machida. They were training there, and I just felt, it's a good opportunity for me to go there training with them a little bit. And I remember, I think the last time I came to train New York, you were there and you helped me a lot. I'll never forget that. You helped me on the train. You came on the fight. It was great times. I think I lost that fight, right? The fight that got knocked out.
No problem.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't matter.
Happens. But the whole MMA thing for you was a tough one, Hodge, because you started relatively late in mixed martial arts, and it was also tough for you because I always felt like the weight division categories were difficult for you. You were too big for 185. The weight cut used to kill you, take away too much energy, and you were too small for 205. I always felt if there was a 192 division, you would have been much more successful. But even starting late, you did incredibly well in MMA. Like you easily broke through to the top 10 ranks in MMA, and without it ever really being your primary focus. And I always felt that it was a tremendous indication of just how sound your control-based jiu-jitsu game was, that with relatively little MMA training, you were able to break into the top 10 and do incredibly well against some very good athletes. I mean, some of the people you beat, Randleman, these are MMA legends. And to do that with relatively little MMA training just shows you just how effective a strong traditional base in jiu-jitsu can be, even in the mixed martial arts context.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I was between the weight division, and I had fun fighting MMA, but it wasn't really my focus. And I tried to do sideways to, jiu-jitsu and fighting no gi. I think the end was difficult because I never really want to stop fighting with the gi because, jiu-jitsu, because that was still my sport, something that was my passion. That's what I chose to do. I think I fought MMA more because I was a Gracie. I don't. If I didn't have the Gracie name, I don't think I would have been fighting MMA. But I mean, it was fun. I had a good time. I cannot complain.
Yeah. Now, one of the most remarkable things about your career, Hodger, is you essentially beat 3 generations of great jiu-jitsu athletes. When you were a young man and first came up through the ranks, you beat many of the legends of the previous generation of jiu-jitsu athletes. Then in the main part of your career, you beat everyone they put in front of you. And then you had time off and came back and beat the next generation of athletes, the biggest star. So a remarkable aspect of your career is that you had very dominant, mostly submission-based victories against 3 generations of jiu-jitsu players. That's remarkable because the sport of jiu-jitsu changes very rapidly, especially the gi game. And you were able to impose your game upon 3 different generations of jiu-jitsu. And again, it goes back to that idea of the incredible versatility of a control-based, positional-based game. A traditional game of jiu-jitsu is just so remarkably adaptable to different contexts. You got it to work in MMA. You got it to work on 3 different generations of jiu-jitsu and get incredible results, almost every match by submission. That was a remarkable testimony to your approach to the sport.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you. I see I had a good run. A lot of fun. Sometimes I miss it, but you know, I'm glad it's over. It's at some point it has to be over. You know, you cannot be athletes forever. Now I'll be 39 this year, so I'm you know, looking back, it's I feel fulfilled. You know, I think I feel like I've done. I'm happy with what I've done. I think it's not with what I achieve. I think it's the run itself. You know, it's the whole life training, dedicating, trying to be better, feeling you progress, competing. You know, being in extreme situations, fighting, challenging, physically, emotion, going through difficult challenge. You know, sometimes I think things that I'm most proud, it's moments that it's, you know, you're tired and you have to push, but like you're really tired and you still halfway through the fight, you know, your legs are shaking. You know, do you give up or you ignore, you know, mentally you go through the pain. I think moments like that is what makes me proud of myself as a fighter, you know, in terms of not it's the medals I have. I don't really care for the medals. You know, most of my medals used to sit in a box in the basement of my house for years. You know, I've just hanged them recently because pressure of the students, people used to come in my house, used to look at my box of medals. They're like, what are you doing? They're getting rusty, you know, inside.
That's funny.
I decided to, you know, to hang them in the academy, but that came like years and years.
Yeah.
But it's, you know.
What people really admire the most about your career, Hodges, that you very much stood for something as an athlete. Like many athletes come in and their intention is just to win. Okay, they just come in. Okay, if I just win the match, that's all I'm looking for. But you did something much more significant than that. You didn't fight, as you say, for medals. You fought for an ideal, and that ideal was positional control leading to submission. You won almost every match, including your most significant matches, by submission. And this was at a time when relatively few jiu-jitsu matches were won by submission. The overwhelming majority were won by advantage or some kind of match tactics. You pretty much ignored match tactics in the sport of jiu-jitsu. And your tactic was, if I get a hold of this guy, I'm going to hold him down, control him, and finish him. And you did that, as I said, to 3 different generations of jiu-jitsu players. I think what people find most remarkable about your career is that you weren't just the guy who was happy to win. You represented an ideal of the sport. Jiu-jitsu is the science and the art of control leading to submission. So many athletes over the last 25 years have branched away from that and looked to win by advantage or through the application of some kind of tactics in the match. Of course, tactics are important, but no one got closer to that jiu-jitsu ideal, and no one fought harder for it. On the few occasions that you lost in jiu-jitsu, there weren't many, but on the few that did happen, it was largely because the other guy engaged in tactics while you were trying to finish the other guy. And I think what was most memorable about your performance in the sport was that you had an ideal and you fought towards it, and in the overwhelming majority of cases you achieved that ideal. It wasn't just that you were coming out to beat the other guy, you were coming out to finish the other guy. And the whole soul of our sport, the whole manner in which what attracts people to jiu-jitsu is this idea of the idea of control to submission, and you manifested that better than anyone else in your generation. I think that's what people look up to you so much for, and what makes you stand out. It's not just the fact that you won, but the manner in which you won, which makes you stand out completely from the crowd, and made you incontestably the best of your generation.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I mean, it's how you see things and what you're trying to achieve, you know. like you say, is that I never really fought for medals. I fought for the sake of being the best. And the only way to be the best is to win against your opponent, but not just win, because winning by advantage, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that you're the best. It just proves that you want that specifically match. The only way to be the best is to submit in your opponent, because then there's no doubt who's the best. If I can win by takedown, the takedown made me win. If we fight 10 times, every time will be different. It's if you can only win by advantage or 2 points, it means that you're still almost in the same level as the person you're fighting. But if you're able to submit the other person, then it puts you in another level. And I think that's what I always try to achieve, to really be better than my opponents. And the only real way to prove that is through submission. Even you can, win by 2 or 5 points, but you still put you in a similar level on your opponent. It puts you slightly ahead because you won, you're able to do more than him. But it's still very close. And especially looking back at some of the matches I have and, like bad referees' decisions, for me, it was always clear that I need to submit everyone to really has no doubt of that I'm better, and that's why I always train to be the best, to beat everyone.
I have to say, Hodgie, you had a huge influence on me from that period, 2003, all the way through to the time when you began MMA, in really emphasizing this idea of the only kind of outcome that really counts is submission. And you see that in my coaching philosophy. I inherited that from you with the extraordinary submission rates of the squad. Even now, my athletes are never happy with just winning. It's only winning by submission satisfies them. And you were a huge part of that. Your influence on me was very strong there. And you see the truth of your words in sports like mixed martial arts. Like, how many times have you seen a situation where a guy gets taken down and then 3 seconds later he's back up on his feet? Like in a fight, just getting a takedown doesn't really mean that much. A guy can always just get back up to his feet. How many times have you seen a guy get to a position and the guy on bottom just scrambles out and gets away? Just scoring points, as you say, Hodge, doesn't really indicate dominance, but submission in almost every case. There are some exceptions. There are some flying submissions which don't indicate dominance, but in most cases, the overwhelming majority of cases, submission is a true checkmate in the sport, which indicates dominance and a unconditional surrender, an unambiguous victory. Whereas winning by takedown, winning by advantage, these are very ambiguous victories. And in other sports like mixed martial arts, you can see that they don't really contribute at all to, let me rephrase that, they don't indicate any kind of dominance whatsoever. Like, you can have an athlete who gets taken down 6 times in a mixed martial arts fight, stands back up to his feet, and then knocks the other guy out. Right? So how valuable were the takedowns? But control leading to submission, that indicates true dominance. And you were the greatest ideal of that in your generation. That had a huge impact on me and the way in which I coach my squad. And you see, they strongly emphasize the idea of control leading to submission.
Yeah. No, I can see that with your team, And I mean, fighting, you wanna win a fight, you have to dominate your opponent. That's the only way to, to win. I mean, not the only way to win, but you want to dominate someone. You need to pin him down. Then when he cannot move, choke him out.
I heard you were pretty good at that.
I try.
What?
Sorry. Você tem câmera aqui, só para te avisar.
Vou mostrar.
Tá bom, vai lá e depois eu volto. Sorry, guys. Just in case. So John, I told people that they could ask you a few questions. So to put on the chat. So let me just run through some of the questions here, see if there's any interesting ones. So guys, when you send a question, please, interesting questions. Otherwise, they'll be ignored. uh, Someone saying Gary's stand DVD is amazing.
That actually raises an interesting point, Hodger. One of the things I strongly emphasize in my coaching program is I never just teach my athletes to perform. I teach them to teach. Okay, if you look at all of my students, every single one of my senior students is not only an outstanding athlete, they're an outstanding teacher. Again, this is something you were a big influence on me. For those of you who don't know, Hodger is not only the greatest jiu-jitsu player of his generation, he's also one of the greatest teachers of his generation. I don't know if you've ever been to a Hodger Gracie seminar or been to a school or seen his online course program. Hodger is one of the greatest teachers I've ever seen. He has a very subtle, understated teaching style, but one of the absolute best I've seen in my entire career. That was another sense in which Hodger influenced me. Whenever I go to teach my students, I teach them to teach, because nothing improves your understanding of the sport of jiu-jitsu better than teaching it to other people. That was one of my lessons as a young purple belt when Henzo came to me all those years ago and said, John, you got to start teaching classes. I was a part-time amateur in the sport. I wasn't even taking the sport that seriously. Suddenly I had to teach, and that changed my whole outlook. Yeah. It took me to where I am. So the question was, you know, I got his DVD. He's a great teacher. That applies to all of my students. And I've always noticed that the people who are the most technically adept in the sport are those who teach the most. Hodger was a great teacher. My students are great teachers. And so I strongly emphasize the idea of when I coach my students, I coach them to teach other people, knowing that this will make them better in the long run. Long-term development is often fostered by good teaching skills. You know, Hodger, it's a weird thing about our sport that the best athletes are also expected to be coaches. Like if you look at other sports, no one does that. Like if you look at the best soccer players like Ronaldo, no one expects Ronaldo to open up a soccer school and start teaching students. You know, Mike Tyson, the best boxer of the 1980s, you don't see Mike Tyson open up a boxing school and have to teach and then go out on the weekends and fight. It's a strange thing about jiu-jitsu that the best athletes are expected to also teach as well. Part of that is practical because there's not too much money in jiu-jitsu. And so the athletes have to teach in order to make money. But I've always believed that fact that the best athletes in the sport also have to have a dual role of teacher as well as athlete enhances their technical progress. And much of what I see observing as a coach is that the most technical and technically fluent athletes in the sport are invariably the best teachers. Hodger's a good example. My own students are good examples.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Teaching, it does give you a much better understanding of the techniques because it makes you think. You know, I can say for myself, a lot of the things that I used to do for years and years, I mean, some of the things I did, but, you know, a lot of the things I was doing naturally without actually realizing step by step what I was doing. So it does in a reflective way, but, you know, almost your subconscious does that move without actually you realizing what you're doing step by step. And once you're forced to teach, then you start understanding exact step by step, and teaching improves the technique. You know, every time I've been teaching the same move. Every time I teach, there's something different. You know, it's always a adjustment. So it's always something that to improve, and you see that only when you're teaching, when, you know, because it makes you think of what you're doing. And
yes.
It's very, very important on your technical level to teach, because you start understanding the technique more, the art, instead of, you know, just being like tough. There's a good question here for you, John.
Yeah.
As a philosophy student, has any philosophies influenced on your approach to jiu-jitsu, and in each way?
That's a great question. My area of specialty in philosophy was epistemology, which is questions about the nature and extent of human knowledge. Now, with regards to my philosophy education, the sense in which it was most valuable to my approach to jiu-jitsu was a very general one, which is the idea of I was blessed to have many outstanding teachers in academia, philosophy professors, and I was able to see what made them outstanding teachers. How were they able to convey information? How were they able to crystallize and break down difficult concepts and information and relay it to us as students? And my ability to mimic that in a jiu-jitsu context was very, very valuable. So that was one sense in which just a general philosophy or academic education was useful. Breakdown and assimilation of information, of taking difficult concepts, breaking them down to their core into manageable chunks of information and relaying them to a student. Now, with regards to philosophy in particular, my area of specialty was epistemology and philosophy / history of science. So I was very much locked into this idea of what constituted a scientific method. Now, the best way to approach the sport of jiu-jitsu and combat sports in particular is through a kind of simplified version of scientific method, of trial and error method. And a huge part of my development in jiu-jitsu was the fact that my sensei, Gracie, gave us a very great amount of freedom for research. I remember one day he said to me, "John, I don't care what you do, so long as you can prove to me that it works." Okay, so the idea of proof was very, very important. There's 1,000 interesting theories out there, but what can you prove? And trial and error, of course, through sparring is the main thing. So this fostered in me a sense of looking at a jiu-jitsu training program as a research program, similar to some kind of simplified scientific research program. So it was never the case that I saw jiu-jitsu as something where you just come in, train hard, get tough. It was always about, okay, what's the problem we're trying to investigate? Understand the problem. There's not going to be any solutions until you can clearly state what the problem is. So everything begins with a clear statement of the problem. Once you have that, then it's about researching for solutions. Most of the research was simply experimentation on the mats. I had the good fortune to be teaching full-time 7 days a week for literally hours a day, many hours a day, for over a decade at Henzo's Academy. And in addition, I had many brilliant students like Gracie, who came into the Academy to train with us. So you had this incredible cross-fertilization of hours of training, a clearly stated set of problems, brilliant minds coming in from the outside, offering alternative points of view. And this was a unique opportunity for someone like me to try and gain as much knowledge as I could over time. As I got students around me who were enormously talented individuals, they too are brilliant and creative people. They made additions to what we were doing, and we built in a sense, a kind of a simplified scientific research program where the subject was control leading to submission. And over time, that's how it worked. So I would say, in answer to your question, there's a sense in which any kind of academic study prepares you well for the general skill of breaking down information into chunks and making it manageable for students to learn quickly. That's a general skill you learn in academic study. That was very useful. But the more specific philosophy-based skill came out of the fact that my specialty was epistemology, questions about the nature and extent of human knowledge, what constitutes knowledge, history and philosophy of science. What is the nature of scientific method? That was a big part of my PhD research. And looking at a simplified version of scientific method, a trial and error method, based around clear statement of the problem, interesting hypotheses supplied by my own research on the mat, brilliant students who were coming in and visiting and bringing alternative points of view, the work of my own students who added to the knowledge that I had given them. They're all brilliant and creative people in their own right. And it created a research program over time, which was able to have a strong influence on the sport.
Very interesting, John. Very interesting. There's Stu. Hi, John. You mentioned Tomonagi with regarding to throwing. Do you think this is a good start to focus on?
Oh, that's a great question. I believe that there are certain throws in the judo curriculum which are uniquely well suited to the sport of jiu-jitsu, given our unique rule sets and the unique challenges that the rules and regulations of jiu-jitsu present. If I could only have 2 throws for the rest of my life in jiu-jitsu with a gi, I would probably select tomoe-nage, especially yoko tomoe-nage, the side tomoe-nage. There are other versions, but that I believe is the most.
You put them in the hips, you throw them.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful throw. And also sumigate. Okay, if a developing jiu-jitsu student just had a strong sumigeshi and a strong yoko tomoe-nage, they would do very well. Of course, there are other throws that in time you'd want to learn, but you couldn't go wrong by starting your program with those 2 throws. They're very, very well suited for the sport of jiu-jitsu.
Very good, very good. So that asks Anne's question. What's your view on wrist locks? Since you mentioned leg locks and not ignored but largely frowned, do you think they have a place in jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. These are good questions these kids are asking. Okay, let's put out a general statement here on submissions. People are very quick to make distinctions between different kinds of locks. Okay, leg locks, arm locks, wrist locks. The lock you select is really based around how much control do you have prior to the lock. Okay, the lock is just the full stop at the end of a sentence. It's the sentence that counts, and that sentence is control. When I first started with leg locks, the great problem that I saw with leg locking in the 1990s, for example, is that there was no control. They were just moves where you jumped into it and hoped for the best. Okay, you tried to apply it as quickly as possible before the other guy could react, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. It was more or less a kind of a desperation move. As a result, the lack of control meant many injuries and a lot of failures. My whole thing was to change the nature of leg locking into a control-based game, to really make a deep study of the whole idea of ashigarami, or entangled legs, so that you could control people for long periods of time, the same way you do from the mounted position when you're working for an armbar, the same way you do from guard position when you're working for a triangle. I never say to someone, this kind of joint lock is ineffective. My question is never that. It's not, is the lock effective? My question is always, how effective is the control prior to the lock? Okay, that's the question you need to ask. With regards to leg locks, historically, the control was minimal. That's changed now. If you look at leg lockers now, there's a lot of control that you can put over your opponent through the use of various kinds of ashigarami. If you look at most upper body joint locks, there's a lot of control. They come out of very controlling positions, like variations of guard, mount position, side position. These are very controlling positions. The problem I have with most forms of wrist lock is that there's very little prior control to the application of the move. So at least currently, they tend, in the majority of cases, to be moves where they can have a useful effect to get people to move in certain kinds of way. They can have a good distraction effect, but they're not a systematic, there's no systematic set of controls that lead to their application. There is one interesting counterexample to this, I do believe wrist locks can be highly effective when they are used in the context of a triangle attack. When you have someone's head and arm tied up in a triangle, but the strangle is proving to be very difficult to finish, and for whatever reason you can't switch to an arm lock on the elbow, wrist locks can be very effective there because the triangle gives you a lot of control over your opponent's movement. And so wrist locks out of triangles can be very effective because you have initial control. But wrist locks just performed in the open without some kind of prior control, much more dubious. So I do believe there is a context in which wrist locks can be an important part of your game. But again, it's not about the lock, it's about the control you have prior to the lock. If you can show me prior control to a wrist lock, I'm going to be impressed. And I believe that the best form of prior control to a wrist lock, which we currently have, is through the use of triangles. And wrist locks out of triangles can be a useful way to use that form of submission with excellent control prior to the application of a lock.
Yeah, in wrist locks, I think they work, you'll see more in gi because it's less slippery. It's hard to maintain the hand in position for you to bend the wrist without the gi. It's too slippery. It's hard to, to get control of the arm.
Unless you first have it locked up in a triangle, then you can get it.
Yeah, fully agree. There's a good question here. In your opinion, what's the most effective way to improve? Paying more attention to other people's sparring, maybe a specific way of training?
That's a great question. It's also a huge question. There's a lot to say about this. I'll try and break this down. Okay, first, our ideal in jiu-jitsu is progressive training, okay? If you're getting to a situation where long periods of time are going by and you're questioning whether you're really getting any kind of better, you're getting better at all as time goes by, that's just never a good thing. There should be a sense in which when a year passes by, you should be noticeably better than you were at the start of that year. That should never be in doubt. The question is, okay, how are you going to do this? And how are you going to maximize the rate of progression? It's one thing to make progress, but are you making the most possible progress? That, I think, is the real question you're asking here. I believe the first step is to have a clear understanding of where you stand now. If you don't have a clear idea of what your current level is, what you're currently good at, and what you're currently poor at, and what you need to get to the next level that you desire, it's hard to make any kind of progress. So your first step is always self-assessment. Can you give yourself an accurate self-assessment? And what is that self-assessment going to be based on? Well, it should be based upon how you perform relative to the peers that you have around you. Who are the people you train with? How are you performing with them? What are your most successful elements? What part of the game are you performing well upon them? What parts of the game are you performing poorly? So always begin with the most accurate self-assessment you can give. I believe that the best way to gain self-assessment is through the use of video. Videotape yourself. We often have very inaccurate perceptions about ourselves. We tend to think that we're better than we really are in some ways, and we tend to underestimate ourselves in other ways. Video doesn't lie, okay? Film yourself going against other people and try to make assessments based on what you see in front of you. Listen to the opinions of some people who you trust, but also bear in mind that other people's opinions of you are often inaccurate too. So as I said, video is generally a better way to study yourself than your own perceptions of yourself or other people's perceptions. They also provide a very accurate historical reference so that a year from now you can watch yourself rolling under or sparring under similar circumstances, and you can compare the videos and give it a pretty accurate assessment. Are you making progress or not? Once you have that clear sense of assessment, who am I, what am I good at, what am I not good at, what do I need to improve, then you've got to start building a program which is designed to improve your current strengths and radically improve your current weaknesses. The two kinds of progress you always want to be making are refinement of things you're already good at. Okay, you never want to be static at things you're already good at. You always want to refine them, get better. A good example of Gracie. Roger was always very, very strong in cross-collar strangles. But between 2003 and 2008, he got radically better at them. He was already good, but he wasn't satisfied with that and kept getting better until by 2008, it was almost an unstoppable technique. The other thing is you've got to identify your weaknesses and do something about that. What I will say is that you guys in this generation of jiu-jitsu have something which my generation of jiu-jitsu had to a very limited degree, and previous generations didn't have it all. You live in an information age. Okay, this is a remarkable time in human history where we have greater access to information than any generation previous to us by a landslide. Okay, you can live in the North Pole, far from anywhere, and at any given moment, you can access information from the best world champions. You can go on Gracie's website and learn from the greatest jiu-jitsu athlete of his generation. You can be living in the North Pole and watch ADCC live and see the best athletes in the world competing against each other. Everyone has equal access to information. Once you gain that information, you can use that to build training programs. You don't have to be training with the best guys in the world. You just need access to the information and to train with your peers to make remarkable progress over time. Always remember that Gracie, when he moved to England, was training mostly with white belts and blue belts. And yet that was the time he made the most progress in his career because he had information. He figured things out. He used trial and error methods. He constantly worked with the students. It didn't matter that the students weren't particularly experienced. He was still making incredible progress, more than almost anyone at that time in the world. So I'm a big believer that once you make an accurate self-assessment of who you are, what you're good at, what you're not good at, the information is out there, okay? Then just build a training program based on refining your current strengths and working your way around your current weaknesses. I'm a big believer in positional sparring, so that if you have a current weakness with a certain kind of escape, put yourself in there. Volume of training is the key to success. You got to have knowledge, you got to know what you're doing, and you got to have a high volume of training, exercising that knowledge to turn it into a skill. By focusing on those current weaknesses, you can eventually turn them into strengths. So that we have situations that, as I said earlier in this video, jiu-jitsu was the overall performance of leg locks in jiu-jitsu 10 years ago was terrible. It was a disaster. And yet now it's one of the strongest aspects of the sport. You will be amazed at what time can do once you make a strong assessment of where you currently stand, an accurate self-diagnosis, usually best done through the use of video, the acquisition of knowledge, and you have a greater ability to make use of that now than any other point in human history. You can go on Hodge's website. There's numerous websites out there. There's instructional videos. You can just watch match footage of the best athletes in the world. There's an incredible opportunity for anyone, regardless of location, to gain information. Then it's a question of taking that information and building it into physical skills. Okay, it's not enough just to have knowledge. You've got to be able to perform, and that will come from a training program, which I believe should be focused primarily around positional sparring and the drilling of moves until you feel. And initially, you have to drill moves with a lack of resistance, just to get a basic feeling for the technique. And then you have to progressively work against tougher and tougher opponents, applying it under sparring conditions. And if you can do this over time, you can make remarkable progress. There's an old saying that most people tend to greatly overestimate what they can do in terms of progress over a 6-month period, but greatly underestimate what they can do over a 5 to 10 year period. Okay, if you just have some patience and work in this disciplined manner, based on a clear assessment of where you stand now, the acquisition of knowledge, and the turning of that knowledge into physical skill through a specialized training program based largely around positional sparring and drilling, you'll be amazed at what you can do to transform yourself in 5 to 10 years.
I think you're burning a lot of people neurons there, John. It's no, I fully agree with you. I think making one note that in terms of improving in practice, when you're actually training with someone, of course you need to assess everything, know exactly what you're doing. But in terms of when you're actually practicing, the best way to improve, it's there's no doubt that it's through specific sparring, because I'm not a believer of drilling, and I think I can I know you, and you just put now yourself, you drill to learn the mechanics. Once you learn the mechanics, there's no reason to drill anymore, because it's not like it's different. If you want to drill a throw, for example, stand up, you need to drill 1,000 times, because you need the timing. It's you get from drilling, judo, you get a lot of things from drilling on standing up. On the ground game, you don't get anything from drilling, because you need to you practice the move, but the moment the other person is moving, now you're not drilling much. You need to put resistance to be able to really implement the technique. And when you do the specific sparring, is the repetition that tells you what you're doing wrong and what you're doing right. Because when you go over the same movement over and over again with sparring, then you see, even you might take longer to see what's happening, but eventually you will do. Because if you keep doing the same escape, let's say we're doing specific from, side control, and every time I'm attempting to escape, I'm failing. But we're always in the same situation. So I'm constantly trying different ways. And the moment that I find something that works, that's the direction that you start going towards it. And even if, it doesn't work straight away, but you're always going back, eventually you start changing things and adapting. And that's how you improve, because you need to spend time at that specific situation. And the only way to spend enough time for you to actually see, your pros and cons is through specific sparring. The full sparring, you get to have fun. You don't really learn much, because you don't spend much time in each position. You spend little time in many situations with the specific sparring. It's no, I mean, that's how I always try develop my skills, through specific sparring. So any area that I wanted to improve, that my focus was on specific sparring. When you get to spend time, you found that if I want to improve my submission from the back, I'm going to start on your back, and as I'm trying to attack, you escape, and then I'm going to do I keep doing the same thing over and over again, and you keep escaping over and over, and then suddenly I do something different that now I can hold you longer. That's how you improve, through things like that, in my opinion. Of course, you need to, learn. You cannot do that on your own without, knowledge or learning, someone giving you techniques to actually try on. But once you have them, you practice them on specific sparring, no doubt.
Well said, Hodge. The whole idea is to transform knowledge into skill. Okay, you have to make a strong distinction between knowledge and skill. If you have no knowledge, then the situational sparring it'll make you tough, but it won't help much, because you don't have a sense of direction in your sparring. You're just trying to survive, or just clumsily trying to win if you're in the dominant position. But once you have a sense of what am I trying to accomplish in this situational sparring, or specific sparring, as Hodge calls it, that's when the magic starts to happen. Ultimately, you need to have a high volume of training. And what situational sparring does is it gives you tremendous volume of training in specific areas in a relatively short time frame. So you can get very good very quickly in those specific areas. Then you start patching those areas together, and that's when you start training under feet to floor conditions, and suddenly you notice you're significantly better than you were, say 3 months ago or 6 months ago. I should add, Hodge, I'm getting a warning on my phone saying that the battery is running low. So if I cut off at any point, I apologize in advance.
I was gonna say that now. I mean, we can carry on for hours, but we're here almost 2 hours. And John, I really appreciate your time.
Oh,
I know
it's
you.
my pleasure.
And it's a real pleasure to have you here with us. I think most people watching, they are they're my students or students of the affiliated schools. I'm pretty sure there's some people from there's not part of the association because we open slightly, but most people watching here, they are part of the association. And I'm very, very pleased that you took your time, and it's very early in you. We started like 7:30 a.m. at New York time. So, once again, John, I really appreciate your time. I
It's
think it
my
was
pleasure,
very
Roger.
inspiring for me, and I'm pretty sure it was for everyone. I think we go back over 20 years, since I've been
Yeah.
coming to New York. I've saw you, from when I was very young, and you were always very inspiring in many different ways, on and off the mat. You are a person who wants to start teaching and living through jiu-jitsu. You got fully committed in every aspect in teaching and living. I believe I've never asked you that, but I think it's pretty much truth. You used to have you sleep on the mat, to put a mat on your house. So for you to, not even when you're home, you were still like, having jiu-jitsu in every aspect, anywhere you go. You're the kind of guy that you go to a wedding with a lycra. But that just show you.
I started very late. I was 28 when I started jiu-jitsu, and most of the good players of the sport started very young. So I definitely had to play a lot of catch up. Hodger, you said we go back 20 years in the academy, knowing each other and working together. I always wanted to say thank you so much for the incredible work you did, being an icon and a leader in the sport of jiu-jitsu. To your students who are watching this videotape, I hope and trust that you understand how fortunate you are to have Hodger as your teacher. He was, without any question, the greatest player of his generation. As I said earlier in this video, he decisively defeated not only his generation of jiu-jitsu, but the previous and the succeeding generation as well. Working with him was one of the absolute highlights of my coaching career. And he had a seminal influence not only upon my outlook on the sport, but upon the sport in general. He represented the jiu-jitsu ideal of control to submission better than anyone else in his generation. He did it in the context of gi, no gi, and mixed martial arts. It's just a remarkable testimony to his game. So I hope you're all deeply appreciative of what he does, both in his school in England and his website for the world. It'll always be one of the most cherished memories I have in jiu-jitsu, the times he would come to New York and prepare for some of the greatest performances in jiu-jitsu history. I'll never forget the 2005 ADCC training camp. That was just an incredible thing to be around and be a part of. And there were numerous other camps similar in nature. Thank you so much, Hodger, for the impact you've had on the sport and the leadership that you've shown over all these years. It's been a remarkable thing to observe, and it's incredible to see your students coming to New York now and exhibiting the kind of game the same ideal that you espouse, and see the progress that they're making. Thank you so much.
John, thank you very much, my friend. It's an awesome pleasure. Anything you need, remember, I'm always here. And hopefully when this craziness is over, I'll be able to come to New York and, share the mats with you guys. Maybe, get to learn some of your leg locks expertise. And,
God help us if you figure out leg locks. My God, we'll be crushed. For all of you who are in a situation as we pretty much all are now, we can't train. This is a tough time for the jiu-jitsu community, but don't worry, this is not going to last forever. We'll be back in the gym, and now is the time for knowledge acquisition. And even though our ability to train the skills is not as good as it was previous times. We can't go to the gym and practice skills. This is a good time for you to work on your knowledge. Okay, so study that videotape. Have a look at Hodges' techniques online, and that's as good as it gets in the sport. And work on knowledge acquisition. When this madness is over, you'll get your chance to turn that knowledge into skills in the ways that we talked about, and you'll become closer to your jiu-jitsu goals.
Awesome. John, I'll cancel the meeting. Guys, thank you very much for being here. I hope you all enjoy it. I'm very, very pleased with John and everything he told us. And that's it. So I guess I'll see you guys around. John, again, and I'll call you soon. Let's talk about philosophy. Yeah, I want to start. I'm part of a philosophy group.
No.
Yeah, I'm just joined to to a little bit. So I need to to get some ideas from you.
Perfect.
I'll call you another time to talk about that.
Excellent. And if you want to have another chat session in the future, of course, it would be a pleasure, Hodja.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you so much. I'll go.
Bye.
Guys, thank you very much. See you soon. Take care. Thanks, John.
Goodbye.